I'm here with Derek Black, who is the author of Schoolhouse Burning and a professor at USC Law School. How are you doing in the middle of this ridiculous time? Ridiculous is a kind word for it.
Yeah, I'm doing as well as I can. Thanks, Emma.
Yeah, well, good to hear it. I wanted to talk a little bit about your book and just the topic of public education in this country, which is constantly under assault. I would say more so under this administration than it has been in a while, although, when you look, it can be kind of ubiquitous across both parties when we're talking about public education. Can you talk about what you see in terms of the state of things and also what your thoughts are when it comes to the push to return to schools and just in general?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think something has changed in the last decade, and you're right. I mean, public education has had its problems over the last decade and several decades. But if you really look at the way that the language has changed in the last few years, what we find is a direct attack on the idea of public education itself. So, in prior administrations and prior times, there may have been differences of opinion about what's sort of the most effective policy. Should we have small class size, large class size? But all of that was a debate within a public education system. What we now literally have are people saying that we should do away with the public education itself, that we should move towards a privatized system. And so that's a fundamental change in terms of how we talk about schools. And of course, the current crisis is creating leverage for that. The Secretary of Education DeVos and President Trump, they've had their design on privatization for quite some time. But what they have done is use this current pandemic as an excuse to further demonize public schools and blame the pandemic on them, right? So it's their fault that we can't have school, but private schools, they're great, they're ready and willing, that's the narrative. And so they've tried to move more money into the private sector and more students out of the public sector.
Yeah, and I think it's clear why they're doing this. Obviously, there's a profit motivation, but usually when you're seeing the privatization of schools and the push for it, it tends to be not in the wealthiest areas of the country, not in the whitest areas of the country. Can you talk about how that push nationally is more, I was gonna say quarantined, but more sectioned off in the South and in minority areas than it is in wider areas of the country?
Yeah, that was one of the most troubling things that I found in doing my research. I mean, when I first began, I was looking at privatization and the challenge to public education at really a national level and hadn't drilled down on the geographic and the racial aspects of it. But there's some great reports and studies out there by the Network for Public Education. And what I did was take the data that they had produced and mapped it out in terms of who had the most privatization, who had the least. And when we look at our states that have the highest level of white students, there's almost no privatization there. So we look in the upper Northwest or the Midwest, and Nebraska, there's almost no privatization there at all. Also, West Virginia, right? Almost entirely white, rural West Virginia, none. But when you look at the Southeast, there's this huge, enormous block where there is extremely high levels of privatization, and the same thing in the Southwest as well. So what I sort of tell in the book is the idea that this push to privatize is also caught up with the idea that government, or at least some aspects of government, does not want to fund the public education of low income and minority children.
And I mean, I think that boogie woman for that kind of perspective is really exemplified by Betsy DeVos. She's obviously kind of had her mask off when it comes to her very obvious efforts to privatize education in this country. And that was a huge part of her legacy in Michigan. So can you talk about her effect on public education and what that, how that fit into your research?
Well, I'll have to say that she kind of caught me off guard. I was talking to some folks in Michigan recently, and he said, "Well, why is that? She's behaved this way for a long time." And I said, "Yeah, but normal people don't normally behave this way." The idea that the U.S. Secretary of Education would leverage a pandemic to further her agenda was just startling. I mean, and she's been around for 3 years. You think I would have not been surprised, but I think even Congress was. I mean, they wrote the CARES Act, assuming that at least for this period of time, she would put aside her agenda and just do what's right by kids, right? Congress handed out, hundreds of millions of dollars for public education to make sure they were safe, distance learning, et cetera. And what does she do? As soon as she gets the money, she starts talking about creating a voucher program with that money. She starts insisting that public schools share enormous amounts of their money with the private schools and passing regulations to that effect. And then starts, suggesting to governors that they ought to use their coronavirus funds for vouchers as well. And it's really just amazing. It's like when you go to the doctor, you expect the doctor to treat you. You don't expect the doctor to sell you cell phones, for instance. Well, I think when we have a Secretary of Education, we expect her to take care of public schools, not try to take care of private schools, at least in a pandemic. But she's proven me wrong on that.
Yeah, I mean, the grift is unbelievable. And I think it's a shamelessness that's rampant in her family. Obviously, Eric Prince is one of the most notorious mercenaries in the country, and Betsy DeVos has shown similar shamelessness. Can you talk though about, you're talking about vouchers. Can you explain to the viewer what vouchers are when it comes to talking about public school funding? Because I think they can sound innocuous, but what it really does is just saps public school systems of resources. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, on one level, we all love for someone to pay for something else for us. And on one level, that is the innocuous sounding nature of private school. Well, if I can get government to pay for it, why shouldn't I? Or I'm already paying taxes, well, why shouldn't I get something back? But the way that at least state level vouchers operate, and the ones that are floating around out there, is here in South Carolina, for instance, the bill has been that whatever amount of money that the state normally gives to a public school for public education, if that student decides that they want to go to private school, they will take the entirety, or the plan is to take the entirety of those funds and give them to the private school. So that doesn't now. So let's think about it. Let's say that 10 kids leave a high school, for instance, and that means, let's say, $60,000 comes out of the public school budget and goes to private schools. But that public school is going to still need the exact same number of teachers, have the exact same light bill, have the exact same number of bus routes to run. And so their costs aren't going to go down, but $60,000 just went out the door. And a lot of schools, we're talking about a lot more than just $60,000. So it is literally robbing the public coffers and sending it to a private institution. And that's the point, right? They do want to destabilize the public system and move children towards a private system.
And can you, one, explain further the incentive structure behind doing so? Why Betsy DeVos and others like her want that to happen? And I kind of know the answer, but I will also add, I feel like when talking about charter schools, a lot of people have gotten themselves to believe that, well, then this allows the cream to rise to the top. Then the children who are the most talented will benefit from this, and they've kind of internalized that, as opposed to saying, oh no, these systems that could benefit everybody could allow for more prosperity for all students. And then secondly, why you kind of think education is seen as a bit of a dry topic in this country when it's so integral to how every child becomes who they are and how they affect our society.
Yeah, well, in terms of the motivations, I mean, there is, putting DeVos aside just for a moment, but it's sort of the overall ideology there. Ultimately, you have the Koch brothers and a lot of other folks like that going back decades that believes that government in the United States is designed, or what it has been designed to do in recent decades, is take money from wealthy people and give it to poor people, right? And so, at the federal level, the number one target is healthcare, Social Security, things of that nature. But at the state and local level, the overwhelming amount of money is spent on public schools. So if you think government is extracting money and giving it to poor people at the local level, we're talking about public education. So a lot of this is just about lowering taxes, like reducing governmental responsibility. And as Grover Norquist has said, to shrink government to the size that you can drown it in a bathtub. And that's ultimately what they're trying to do. The other part of this, though, which you're mentioning, is that when kids leave so the public system is open to everyone. They don't get to say no to any child, but the private system can pick and choose. And so what we really are seeing in the private system, whether it be charters or vouchers, is a sorting of students, that they sort into groups based upon religion, they sort into groups based upon other demographics, socioeconomic status, and race. And so we go go from a public system that must accept all to a private one that looks much differently than that. And our private schools and our charter schools, for instance, have far, far fewer students with disability, for instance, than our public schools. So they are taking what we might say the cheapest students to educate, the non-disabled, and leaving the most expensive students in the public schools. Same thing with ELL students. So we see this sort of dynamic of the sorting out of students, those that the private system wants to teach and those that it does not want to teach, and it produces segregation.
Right, it's just segregation by another name. I want to thank you so much for coming on and talking about your book. Can you tell people where they can find it and how they can read it?
Yeah, Schoolhouse Burning. It's available, anywhere books are sold. And if you want to get sort of up-to-date reviews and that sort of thing, you can follow me on @DerrickW.Black. And I'm always sort of talking about what the hot topics of the day are in education law and inequality. Thanks
so much. Have a great rest of your night.
Thank you too.
2 easy ways to follow the Young Turks. One is hit the subscribe button down below. Then you're a TYT subscriber. And second is ring the bell. And when you do that on YouTube, you're notified of our videos.